Okay, this next video introduces art of the Baroque period, focusing specifically on Italy, but first we'll introduce a few key concepts with the Baroque. So first off, the term Baroque is a French term based on barocco, which is a Portuguese term for a misshapen pearl. So it's kind of a long track of different names going there, but the idea here is that it's something more unusual. We're moving away from the harmony and simplistic forms or simple forms of the High Renaissance. So here I'm just giving you some misshapen pearls, which were really common for jewelry during the late Renaissance and Baroque periods. So giving you that just as a frame of reference. So key ideas associated with the Baroque, first of all, drama. The idea of drama is really important in the Baroque. Grand scale, that is building on a grand scale or using large size. We see that in a number of cases. And then it also tends to be visually rich. So the Baroque style is a little bit harder to pin down, however, than the High Renaissance style. It's a little bit, it has a lot of variety to it, which reflects its complexity. So these are some different types of Baroque style. So first there's what we would call dynamic or ecstatic Baroque. So dynamic or ecstatic Baroque means that there's a lot of drama in the piece, that there's a lot of visual interest, that there's a lot of detail. There's also Baroque classicism, which incorporates some of these dynamic qualities, but focuses primarily on classical iconography, classical imagery, or classical stylistic features. There's also Baroque realism. We'll associate Baroque realism with artists like Caravaggio, where we're moving beyond the idealism of the High Renaissance and into more nitty-gritty realism with dark shadows and figures that appear dirty, and it's very exciting. And then finally, we'll look at examples of the Ultra Baroque in Mexico. And I always like to say this is an example of a Baroque on steroids, where you take the Baroque style, this dynamic, ecstatic style, and you cover every bit of the wall and you cover everything on the facade and make it extremely ornate and extremely rich. And in the case of Mexico, we'll talk about how it can have some carryover, or how it could be a case of hybridity with some of the art that was already being produced in Mexico before the arrival of the Spanish. Just a brief historical background. Europe in the 17th century was it was a very tumultuous period. You have the 30 Years' War, you had wars of religion. These wars developed due to tensions between Catholics and Protestants, but then also between primary ruling families such as the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, these ruling families that were dominating large areas of Europe. To start off in Italy, there is this feeling, generally around 1600, of Catholic triumph, this feeling that Rome and the Vatican have survived the Reformation, that they're still around, people are returning to the church, people who had left the church, been disenchanted with the church, are coming back, and just the fact that the church still survives, that's something that they're excited about. So let's see some of the works that they commissioned at the Vatican. So first off, Bernini in the mid to late 17th century is commissioned with his workshop to create this Piazza of St. Peter's Basilica, which are basically these arms. Most people refer to them as arms, that reach out and create a form to this piazza space in front of the church. So before, there had just kind of been this open space where people could gather, but what Bernini does is, through this design, he creates a much more defined space. And what's nice about it is it really looks like arms bringing people into the church, drawing people towards the church. So it fits the Counter-Reformation mood, it fits the idea that they want people to return to the church, but also this idea that once you enter into it, it becomes this enclosed space and an extension of the church, and the transition space between the secular into the sacred space. So similar to an atrium that you might see in an early Christian basilica, but here it's done in a Baroque style with grand scale, lots of sculpture decorating the top, and also with shapes that we associate with the Baroque style. So rather than a perfect circle, which we would see in the High Renaissance, we see an oval, and we see more unusual forms. Instead of a square, we're seeing more of like a trapezoid shape. This is something we would refer to as Baroque classicism, so in those categories that I just gave. So just to give you a sense of the scale, the grand scale, you have almost 300 columns, the columns are extremely tall, almost 40 feet tall, 96 marble sculptures. So clearly this was a huge project and reflected this feeling of triumph. Bernini also was commissioned to create a baldacchino, or a canopy, that would mark the spot where St. Peter's tomb was believed to have been. And then also, if you go downstairs, you can see there's papal tombs, and then further down there's this metal box that's believed to hold the relics of St. Peter. And so you have here a layering of the first pope and then additional popes on top of that. But this creates a permanent canopy that looks to be cloth in certain parts. So you see kind of these hanging bits. So it gives you this illusion of a temporary canopy that might be carried over a martyr's tomb, because of course St. Peter was thought to be a martyr, an early Christian martyr, and it makes it permanent. And then also, because it is so tall, it helps span this massive space from floor to ceiling. So very, very tall structure, 70 feet tall. And then in addition to that, you have the chair of St. Peter at the Cathedra Petri back here. This is very dynamic, ecstatic Baroque, the swirling columns, the large shapes, the gilding, all of the different forms, the exploding cloud back here. It's very, very visually rich. But just on a side note, those swirling columns are derived from forms that were taken from the Temple of Solomon. So it was believed to be a form that originally appeared in the Temple of Solomon. Let's just look closer up on the chair of St. Peter, a chair that has been encased in bronze as a relic, and then there are parts of it being held by the 4 doctors of the church, and then they're using the light that's entering into the window. Rather than making it a stained glass window of a more Gothic type, it becomes golden, and so you have this golden light of the Holy Spirit with a dove incorporated, and it seems to be bursting, or like a window that seems to be exploding there. Also in St. Peter's, you have St. Longinus. So they received a relic around this time and wanted to commemorate it with a statue. And Bernini created this sculpture in honor of St. Longinus. And clearly we're seeing how things are changing in the Baroque period, whereas in the High Renaissance with Michelangelo's David, we see a fairly static figure. He looks very natural with his contrapposto pose, but here we see Bernini really pushing the limits of marble, really making the figures much more dynamic, having that fabric have a much more agitated look to it. So this was to commemorate more relics that were coming into the church. That was obviously something very important to the Catholic faith, and they're emphasizing that here. So what we see in this church at this point is that they're not shying away from representations of holy figures, and they're not shying away from ornate decoration. They're clearly charting a different path than the Protestants are in the north. So they're creating a clear difference, and we'll look at an example of a Protestant church in the lecture on the Dutch Republic. So let's see what Bernini was up to, Bernini being the preeminent sculptor in the Baroque period in Italy. Let's see what he was up to for more private collectors. So Cardinal Scipione Borghese, who was one of the preeminent collectors in this period, collected a series of mythological stories. He also collected a David sculpture. But let's look at 2 scenes of abduction. One is particularly violent. We see here a story of Pluto and Proserpina, and if we could zoom in a little closer, you would see that his fingers look to be like pressing into her thighs. So Bernini is really taking advantage, or really showing off his skill in the carving of marble by showing how he can really turn marble into this fleshy looking substance. So what we see here is Pluto, a god of the underworld, who's wearing his crown, who's grabbing onto Proserpina, who he abducts. She's the daughter of Ceres, who is the goddess of the harvest. And so anyways, the story relates to how the seasons were developed. Proserpina, in the half year that she would spend with Pluto, those were the months when things were dead and the earth was sad. So fall and winter, and then spring and summer are the 6 months that she's able to come up and be with her mother. So it's kind of an early story of dividing custody there. But anyways, it's in a very Baroque setting. You can see all the different marble and granite that decorates this room, and just the fact that the marble isn't static. It's moving, and it appears to move, and it's a very exciting sculpture. Another sculpture that appears to turn marble into something else is this work of Apollo and Daphne, another story of a man chasing a woman, this time unsuccessfully. Apollo chases after Daphne, who is a nymph that he's fallen in love with. She's the daughter of a river god, and so he's chasing after her, chasing, and she calls out to her father to save her, and So at the last minute he does, but she turns into a tree. So this is a very famous story from Ovid's Metamorphosis, which was a very famous ancient poem that the cardinal was familiar with. And so what we see here is that moment when Apollo catches her and her body is transforming, her body is turning into a tree trunk, her fingers are turning into branches. So very exciting, ecstatic, Baroque characteristics. Bernini wasn't always in the good graces of the papacy, so in times when he wasn't getting along with the papacy, he would do commissions such as this. This is commissioned by a cardinal, Federico Cornaro. This is called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and this highlights the intensity of religious belief around this time. So what we have here is a mystic, Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a relatively recent Spanish mystic. And I won't read this whole quote, but you can pause it if you'd like, but it goes into great detail of her intense encounters with God, and that's how, or with an angel, and that's how Bernini is portraying it here, using a variety of materials, using the light that enters in from a skylight, and you see this angel here that's plunging the arrow into her heart, and the agitated fabric lends to this drama. And this all relates to the intensity that we see in a number of areas of Catholicism, including the Jesuits, ideas of the spiritual exercises where one was supposed to contemplate the intense suffering of Christ. We also have traits of Baroque architecture that we should identify, complex ground plans, curved walls, sculpture and architecture fused together, and space that engages the spectator. You're involved in the space. And we see this most clearly at San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, which is in Rome. It's a small church kind of squeezed into this tight intersection, but you can see the facade curves out at you, and as you enter in, it also curves in and out. So again, we're moving away from those traditional spaces to more unusual spaces. And you can also see from the floor plan where you can get a sense of how it curves in and out and engages you. And then gazing up towards the dome, you would also get that same sense where you're not using traditional circles, you're using the oval shape, which was more common in the Baroque period. New types of paintings in the Baroque period include still life, genre, and landscape, and we'll talk about those more as we move along. One of the people that started off with more genre scenes but then moves into a Baroque classical style is Annibale Caracci. When he gets to Rome, he's commissioned by a cardinal to create a series of create a painted room, elaborately painted room in honor of his brother's wedding. And so what we see here is what's called quadro riportato, which are paintings that appear to be lifted and pressed onto the ceiling. So this is all an illusion. Clearly he is trying to outdo Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, but as we zoom in, we can see these loving stories of weddings where we see Bacchus and Ariadne getting married, where we can see Jupiter and Juno together, Diana and Endymion. So again, Caracci is trying to outdo Michelangelo in a Baroque classical style. Okay, we'll finish up thinking about Caravaggio and then one example of the Baroque ceiling. So Caravaggio's style is very distinct. We'll look at the Contarelli chapel very quickly. We see as examples of tenebrism, which is a dramatic shadowy style, bright spotlit effects. And so as we move around this chapel, there are three paintings. One is the Calling of St. Matthew. All of the paintings refer to St. Matthew, who was the named saint of the cardinal who it was built for. So first you see St. Matthew, who's a tax collector, surprised as Christ calls for him. So Christ is here with a gesture clearly referring to Adam's gesture in the Sistine Chapel. Peter is with him, and you see this really gritty tavern scene, and this reflects the kind of environment in Rome in the time when Caravaggio was living. The second scene is the Inspiration of St. Matthew, and this was Caravaggio's first version. It was rejected. This is his second version. It was accepted, and what we see here is St. Matthew in a very simple room being inspired by the angel here. And then the final scene is the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, a very chaotic scene, again spotlit with some dramatic shadows. You see St. Matthew about to be killed, receiving the palm of a martyr, and then it's said to incorporate a self-portrait of Caravaggio. Caravaggio lived a very tumultuous life, which makes him extra famous today. He was accused of murder. He had to leave Rome in exile. So a lot of people associate the violence with the violence in his life. However, Rome at this time was a very, very violent place, and so it could also just refer to a larger context of violence in Rome. Okay, another chapel is the Cerasi chapel. Two more scenes to focus on. So we see here the conversion of St. Paul. This is St. Paul who has fallen from his horse after Christ has come to him in a vision, and this chapel highlights the major scenes or major subjects that are important in the Baroque Counter-Reformation period. That is conversion, so wanting to convert people back to Catholicism, and then also martyrdom. And so you have that St. Paul image right across from this crucifixion of St. Peter image, where you really can zoom in on the flesh of Peter. He looks so real. So all of these Caravaggio images are considered Baroque realism, with those dramatic spotlit effects and dramatic shadows. Caravaggio also created very violent representations of the David, which we see here. This is thought to be a self-portrait, so there could be some psychoanalytic readings. And then our final example is the Triumph of the Barberini, where we see almost an exploding ceiling and an ecstatic